The ladder wobbled dangerously as the elderly man strained to carry a bundle of shingles up its narrow rungs. Frank Dawson stopped mid-step, his 8-year-old daughter Lily tugging gently at his hand as they walked home from his latest odd job. "Stay here for a second, sweetheart," he said, releasing her hand and nodding toward the man perched precariously on the ladder. "That doesn't look safe." Lily, clutching her worn sketchpad tightly, obediently sat down on the curb, her legs swinging as she watched her dad approach the stranger. She'd seen him do this before, step in to help someone just because it was the right thing to do, even when they couldn't afford the luxury of time or energy. "Excuse me, sir," Frank called out as he approached the house. The man, startled, looked down, his weathered face lined with both age and concentration. "I don't mean to intrude, but that's a heavy load you're carrying. Need a hand?" The man blinked at him, clearly assessing the unexpected offer. He was in his late 70s, with silver hair that had thinned over the years, and a pair of spectacles that slipped slightly down his nose. His posture stooped slightly, and his hands shook just enough to make the task in front of him unnerving to witness. "Well," the man said hesitantly, his voice kind but cautious, "I won't say no if you're offering. Name's James Harrington." "Frank," he replied with a nod, already moving toward the ladder. "Frank Dawson. Let me take care of this for you, Mr. Harrington. You shouldn't be climbing up here with this kind of load." James stepped down from the ladder with visible relief, brushing dirt from his hands. "You're a lifesaver, Frank. I've been meaning to fix this roof for weeks now, but it's slow going on my own." "I can imagine," Frank said, hoisting the bundle of shingles with ease. He climbed the ladder carefully, his years of working odd jobs making the motion second nature. "This roof's got some wear and tear. Winter's coming too, good thing you're getting to it now." From her spot on the curb, Lily watched the exchange quietly, her big brown eyes darting between her dad and the man he was helping. When Sadurois, James glanced her way, she gave a shy little wave, her sketchpad resting on her lap. James smiled warmly and waved back. "Your daughter?" he asked as Frank worked above them. "Yeah, that's Lily," Frank replied without pausing, focused on securing the shingles. "She's my shadow most days. Goes where I go." "Smart girl, staying close to her dad," James said, his voice soft. He turned toward Lily and added, "Nice to meet you, young lady." Lily didn't respond verbally but gave him a small, polite smile, before turning back to her drawing. She was sketching the scene in front of her, the ladder, the house, her dad up on the roof, her fingers moving quickly across the page. Frank spent the next hour stabilizing the ladder, adjusting loose shingles, and securing the section that had been giving James trouble. He worked with the efficiency of someone used to manual labor, even though his muscles ached from the long day he'd already put in. James stayed on the ground, passing him tools when needed, and making occasional conversation. "My wife used to help me with things like this," James said at one point, his voice tinged with nostalgia. "She had a knack for making tough jobs feel manageable. Lost her a few years back, though. It's been just me ever since." "I'm sorry to hear that," Frank said sincerely, pausing to wipe sweat from his brow. "It's not easy doing everything on your own." James nodded, his eyes distant for a moment before he snapped back to the present. "But I manage. And with folks like you around, it's a little less lonely." By the time Frank climbed down the ladder, the sun was dipping lower in the sky, casting a golden glow over the neighborhood. He stretched his back and rolled his shoulders, clearly exhausted but satisfied with the work he'd done. "There," he said, patting the side of the ladder. "That should hold up fine now. You might want to double-check it after the next rainstorm, but it's good for the season." James looked genuinely moved. "I don't know how to thank you, Frank. You've done more for me today than you realize." "It's no trouble," Frank replied, brushing off the gratitude. "I'm just glad I could help." James reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded $20 bill, holding it out to Frank. "Here, take this. It's not much, but I want you to have it." Frank hesitated, glancing down at the money. He knew how far $20 could go. Groceries, gas, maybe even a small treat for Lily, but something in him wouldn't let him take it. "I appreciate it, Mr. Harrington, but you keep it. I didn't do this for money." James shook his head, clearly impressed by Frank's refusal. "You're a good man, Frank Dawson. A rare kind of man." Frank smiled sheepishly, rubbing the back of his neck. "Just trying to do right by people." As they prepared to leave, Lily stood up, clutching her sketch pad to her chest. "Bye, Mr. Harrington," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. James's face lit up at the acknowledgement. "Goodbye, Lily. You take care of your dad, okay?" She nodded solemnly, as if accepting a great responsibility, and slipped her hand into Frank's as they walked away. James watched them until they disappeared down the street, shaking his head in quiet wonder. "You've done more for me today than you realize," he murmured to himself, his gaze lingering on the newly repaired section of the roof. Then, with a small smile, he turned and headed inside, his heart just a little lighter than it had been that morning. 2 weeks had passed since Frank and Lily helped James Harrington with his roof. The days had been a blur of scraping by Frank, taking whatever odd jobs he could find, and Lily tagging along, quietly drawing in her sketch pad as she waited for her dad to finish. Bills were piling up at home, and Frank could feel the weight of them pressing harder on his shoulders with each passing day. It was a crisp Saturday afternoon when Frank found himself walking the same route through the neighborhood with Lily. He held a toolbox in one hand and her small hand in the other, his thoughts heavy. He was coming back from patching up a fence for a neighbor a few streets over. The pay wasn't much, but it was something. "Daddy," Lily said, her voice breaking through his thoughts. "Do you think Mr. Harrington's roof is okay now?" Frank glanced down at her, surprised. "I'm sure it's holding up fine." "Why do you ask, sweetheart?" She shrugged, looking up at him with her big, curious eyes. "I just liked him. He seemed nice." Frank smiled faintly. "He did, didn't he?" He paused, glancing in the direction of James's house, which wasn't far from where they were walking. The truth was, he'd been wondering the same thing. James had mentioned there were more repairs to be done, and it didn't sit right with Frank to leave the job half-finished, even if he hadn't promised to come back. "Tell you what," Frank said, squeezing Lily's hand gently. "Why don't we stop by and see how he's doing?" Lily nodded eagerly, and they changed course toward James's house. When they arrived, Frank noticed James sitting on the porch with a book in his lap. He looked surprised when he saw them, approaching but quickly set the book aside and stood up, a warm smile spreading across his face. "Well, if it isn't my roof repair crew," James said, his voice filled with genuine delight. "What brings you by?" Frank held up his toolbox, his smile sheepish. "Just thought we'd check in, see if everything's holding up okay." James chuckled. "You didn't have to do that, but I'm glad you did. Come on up and sit for a bit." They climbed the steps to the porch, and James gestured toward a pair of old but sturdy chairs. Lily hesitated, glancing at her dad, who nodded encouragingly. She perched on the edge of one chair, her sketch pad balanced on her knees. "How's the roof?" Frank asked as he sat down, setting the toolbox at his feet. "Good, thanks to you," James replied. "Haven't had a single leak since you fixed it." He leaned back in his chair, studying Frank for a moment. "But I'm guessing you didn't come all this way just to hear me say that," Frank shrugged, looking slightly embarrassed. "I don't know. Just wanted to make sure you were doing okay." James's expression softened. "That's mighty kind of you, Frank. Not many people would bother." They sat in companionable silence for a moment. The only sounds the rustling of leaves and the faint scratching of Lily's pencil as she worked on a new drawing. "You know," James said after a while, "you remind me a bit of myself when I was your age." Frank raised an eyebrow. "How so?" hardworking, determined. Doing whatever it takes to get by, James said. He glanced at Lily, who was too focused on her drawing to notice. I didn't have much growing up, but I had people who believed in me, made all the difference. Frank nodded slowly, his gaze distant. It's not easy, but you do what you have to for your family. James watched him for a moment, then said, You're a good man, Frank. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. Before Frank could respond, Lily looked up from her sketchpad and said shyly, Mr. Harrington, do you want to see my drawing? James's face lit up. I'd love to, Lily. She hesitated for a moment, then held out the sketchpad. James took it carefully, his expression one of genuine admiration as he studied the drawing. It was a simple but heartfelt depiction of the porch they were sitting on, complete with James in his chair and the book in his lap. This is wonderful, James said, his voice warm. You've got real talent, young lady. Lily beamed, her cheeks turning pink. Thank you, she said softly. James handed the sketchpad back to her and turned to Frank. You've got quite the artist on your hands. She's something special, all right, Frank said, his pride evident. They stayed for a while longer, chatting about little things, James's late wife, Lily's love of drawing, and the neighborhood's quiet charm. When it was time to leave, James walked them to the edge of the porch. Thank you for stopping by, he said, his eyes meeting Frank's. You've got a good heart, and it doesn't go unnoticed. Frank nodded, feeling a lump in his throat. He couldn't quite explain. Take care, Mr. Harrington. You too, Frank. And you, Miss Lily, James said, tipping an imaginary hat to her. As they walked away, Lily looked up at her dad and said, I like him. He's nice. Frank smiled, squeezing her hand. Yeah, he is. They didn't know it yet, but that visit would be the start of something much bigger than a simple act of kindness. For now, though, it was enough to know they had made someone's day a little brighter. Another week had passed, and Frank sat at the small, wobbly kitchen table in their apartment, staring at the eviction notice in his hands. Rent was overdue by nearly 2 months, and he had until the end of the week to come up with the money, or face being forced out. Frank rubbed his temples, exhaustion etched into his face. He'd been working tirelessly, picking up every odd job he could find, but it still wasn't enough. Daddy? Lily's soft voice pulled him from his thoughts. She stood in the doorway, clutching her sketchpad to her chest, her wide eyes full of concern. Are you okay? Frank quickly folded the notice and tucked it into his jacket pocket. He forced a smile. I'm fine, sweetheart. Just a little tired. Lily watched him for a moment, then climbed up onto the chair across from him. You look worried, she said quietly. Frank reached across the table and took her small hand in his. Don't you worry about me, Pumpkin. I'm just figuring some stuff out. That's all. Despite his reassurance, Lily could sense the weight pressing down on her dad. She didn't say anything more, but as Frank stood to grab his jacket, she followed him silently, her sketchpad tucked under her arm. Let's go for a walk, Frank said, hoping the fresh air would clear his head. He didn't have a specific destination in mind, but as they strolled through the neighborhood, his feet seemed to lead him toward James Harrington's house. When they reached the familiar porch, James was outside, raking leaves into neat piles along the edge of his yard. He looked up as they approached, a smile spreading across his face. Well, if it isn't my favorite duo, James called out, leaning on the rake. What brings you by today? Frank smiled faintly, tipping his head in greeting. Just out, for a walk, and thought we'd stop in. Glad you did, James replied, setting the rake aside. Come on in. I was just about to make some tea. Frank hesitated but nodded, following James up the steps and into the house with Lily trailing behind. The interior was warm and inviting, though modest in its decor. A faint smell of cinnamon lingered in the air, and a cozy armchair sat by the window, draped with a knitted blanket. As James busied himself in the kitchen, Frank sat on the edge of the couch, his hands clasped tightly together. Lily, sensing her dad's tension, perched next to him, her sketchpad resting on her lap. "You look like you've got the weight of the world on your shoulders," James said as he returned with a tray, holding 3 steaming mugs. He set it down on the coffee table and handed one to Frank. Frank hesitated before taking the mug, his fingers curling around the warmth. "Just life, you know," he said vaguely. James eyed him thoughtfully, then leaned back in his chair. "You're not the type to complain, Frank, but something tells me you're carrying more than you're letting on." Frank sighed, running a hand through his hair. He wasn't one to open up, especially about his struggles, but there was something about James's presence that made him feel safe. "It's just been hard lately," he admitted. "Work's been slow, and bills don't wait." James nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "I know what that's like," he said after a moment. "There were times when my wife and I barely scraped by, but we always found a way." Frank forced a small smile. "I'll figure it out. I always do." James didn't press further, respecting Frank's pride, but the wheels in his mind were turning. He'd seen enough in his 70-plus years to recognize a man on the edge. After a while, the conversation shifted to lighter topics. James asked Lily about her drawing, and she shyly showed him a picture she'd been working on, an autumn scene with trees shedding their leaves. "This is lovely," James said, his admiration genuine. "You've got a real gift, Lily." She beamed under his praise, her earlier worry momentarily forgotten. As the afternoon light began to fade, Frank stood to leave, thanking James for the tea. "We should get going," he said, glancing at Lily. James walked them to the door, his expression thoughtful. "Frank," he said as they stepped onto the porch, "I've been meaning to ask, what kind of work do you usually do?" "Anything I can find," Frank replied with a shrug. "Repairs, landscaping, odd jobs. Whatever someone needs." James nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "You're a resourceful man. That's a good quality to have," Frank chuckled lightly. "Comes with the territory." James watched them walk down the steps, his hands clasped behind his back. As they disappeared down the street, he turned and headed inside, a plan forming in his mind. The next morning, Frank was startled by a knock at his door. He opened it to find a courier standing there, holding a large envelope. "Frank Dawson?" the courier asked. "That's me," Frank replied, confused. The courier handed him the envelope and tipped his cap. "Have a good day, sir." Frank closed the door and stared at the envelope in his hands. Lily peeked around the corner, her curiosity piqued. "What is it, Daddy?" "I don't know," Frank replied, his brow furrowed. He opened the envelope carefully and pulled out a folded letter and a check. His breath caught in his throat as he read the note. "Dear Frank, your kindness and selflessness haven't gone unnoticed. I know you didn't help me expecting anything in return, but the world needs more people like you. Please accept this as a thank you for being the man you are, a man who puts others first, even when he's struggling himself. Warm regards, James." Harrington Frank's hands shook as he unfolded the check. The amount, $10,000, made his knees weak. He sank into the nearest chair, staring at the paper in disbelief. "Daddy?" Lily's small voice broke through his shock. It's from Mr. Harrington," Frank said, his voice thick with emotion. Lily climbed onto his lap and looked at the check, her eyes wide. "That's a lot of money," she whispered. Frank nodded, a lump forming in his throat. For the first time in weeks, the crushing weight on his shoulders began to lift. "Looks like we're going to be okay, sweetheart," he said, pulling her close. And for the first time in a long time, Frank felt hope. 3 days later, Frank stood outside James Harrington's house, holding Lily's hand. He had thought long and hard about what to say to the man who had changed his life in an instant. Gratitude didn't feel like a big enough word, but he knew he needed to try. Beside him, Lily clutched her sketchpad. Her face lit up with excitement. Frank knocked gently on the door, and within moments James appeared. The older man's warm expression brightened when he saw them standing there. "Well, this is a nice surprise," James said, stepping aside to let them in. Come in, come in. I hope you didn't walk all this way just to see an old man like me." Frank chuckled as they entered the familiar, cozy home. "We wanted to thank you, Mr. Harrington, for everything." James waved a hand dismissively as he led them to the living room. "No need to thank me, Frank. I just did what felt right. Besides, you earned it." Lily hopped up onto the couch, her sketchpad balanced on her knees as she carefully flipped through its pages. Frank sat down beside her, still searching for the right words. "I don't know how you even knew," Frank began, his voice thick. He took a steadying breath. "But that money, it's more than just a lifeline. It's a chance to breathe again. I've been behind on rent for months. I thought..." He paused, swallowing hard. "I thought I was going to lose our home." James leaned back in his armchair, his gaze steady but kind. "I had a feeling you were going through more than you let on. You remind me a lot of myself at your age. Stubborn, hard-working, proud. But even the strongest among us need a little help now and then." Frank nodded, his throat tight. "You didn't have to do it, though. I still can't believe you did." "I didn't have to," James agreed, his voice soft. "But I wanted to. You've got a good heart, Frank, and the kind of kindness you showed me, it deserves to come back to you." Lily, who had been quietly listening, suddenly piped up. "I made something for you, Mr. Harrington." James turned to her, his eyebrows lifting. "You did? Well, now I'm curious." Lily carefully tore a page from her sketchpad and held it out to him. It was a drawing of James sitting on his porch, smiling, with the trees in the background shedding their autumn leaves. Every detail was brought to life with her careful pencil strokes. James took the drawing from her hands, his eyes softening as he studied it. "Lily, this is beautiful," he said, his voice full of admiration. "You've captured my good side, too." Lily giggled, her cheeks turning pink. "I wanted to make you something to say thank you, for helping my dad." James set the drawing down delicately on the coffee table, as if it were the most precious thing in the world. "This means a lot to me, Lily. More than you know." Frank smiled at her, his heart swelling with pride. "She's got a gift, doesn't she?" "That she does," James agreed, nodding. He glanced at Frank, his expression thoughtful. No, I wasn't always in a position to help others. There was a time when my wife and I struggled to make ends meet. But over the years, we built something together, a business, a life. And when I lost her, I realized the only thing that truly mattered was the people you can help along the way." Frank leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "What kind of business was it, if you don't mind me asking?" James smiled, faintly, his gaze distant for a moment. "We ran a small chain of hardware stores. Nothing fancy, but it gave us a good life. When I retired, I sold the business and made sure to live simply. Never needed much, really. My wife always said, if you can't take it with you, you might as well put it to good use while you're here." Frank shook his head in amazement. "I had no idea." James chuckled. "I don't go around advertising it, but I've been lucky, Frank, and it only feels right to share that luck when I can." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the weight of James's words settling over them. Lily swung her legs back and forth as she watched her dad and James exchange quiet smiles. "Mr. Harrington," Frank finally said, his voice steady. "I don't know if I'll ever be able to repay you, but I promise you this, I'll pay it forward. The way you've helped me, I'll make sure to do the same for someone else." James's eyes warmed, and he nodded slowly. That's all I could ever ask for, Frank. Just then, Lily pointed to the drawing on the table. Are you going to keep it, Mr. Harrington? Of course I'm going to keep it, James said with a grin. I'm going to frame it and hang it right here in the living room. That way, I'll always remember my little artist friend. Lily beamed, her small frame practically glowing with pride. Really? Really, James said firmly. It's not every day I get a masterpiece like this. Frank glanced at the clock on the wall and sighed. We should probably get going. Don't want to take up too much of your time. Nonsense, James said, waving a hand. You're welcome here anytime. He stood and walked them to the door, his movement slow but steady. As they stepped outside, he added, And Frank, don't be a stranger. You hear me? I won't, Frank promised, shaking his hand. Thank you again, Mr. Harrington, for everything. James simply nodded, his eyes twinkling. Take care of that little girl. She's got a bright future ahead of her. Frank smiled down at Lily, who gave James a big wave as they walked down the steps. Bye, Mr. Harrington, she called. Goodbye, Lily, James replied, watching them until they disappeared down the street. As Frank and Lily made their way home, Frank felt a sense of peace he hadn't felt in years. The weight on his shoulders was still there, but it was lighter now, manageable. He had hope, and for the first time in a long time, he could see the possibility of a better future not just for himself, but for Lily too. And in a small house on a quiet street, James Harrington sat in his armchair, Lily's drawing resting on the table beside him. A contented smile spread across his face as he thought about the young family he'd come to care for in such a short time. He had given them a gift, yes, but they had given him something, to a renewed sense of purpose and connection. It was a good feeling, he decided.